They dropped it 10,000 feet straight down into the Pacific Ocean. They weren't looking for anything specific. They just changed the way we think about death in the ocean. The camera took 4 hours to reach the bottom. And when it did, it found a 60,000-pound whale skeleton. But the skeleton wasn't bare. It wasn't clean. It wasn't what anyone expected. The entire surface of the whale's bones, the ribs, the spine, every inch of the skull was blanketed in what looked like a thick, blood-red carpet, moving, breathing, alive. The scientists stared at the footage and went completely silent, because those weren't plants. And what they identified next changed everything we thought we knew about how the ocean works, and what's actually happening down there right now, in the dark, on the bones of every whale that has ever died. Stay with me, because this gets stranger the deeper we go. Here's what this video is going to show you. When a whale dies in the open ocean, it doesn't just disappear. What happens to its body over the next 50 years is one of the most complicated, violent, and genuinely bizarre ecological events on the entire planet. And sitting at the center of all of it, the thing running the whole operation from inside the whale's actual bones, is a creature that science didn't even know existed until 2002. A worm, sort of. It has no eyes, no stomach, no mouth. It doesn't chase prey, it doesn't filter water, it doesn't do anything that a living thing is supposed to do to survive. What it does instead is drill directly into solid bone and dissolve it, using acid that it makes itself in its own body. Before this video ends, you're going to understand exactly how it does that, and why that single biological trick may be one of the most important chemical processes in the entire ocean. But first, you need to understand what actually happens to a whale when it dies, because without that context, none of what comes next makes any sense. Picture the deepest part of the ocean you can imagine. Now go 5 times deeper. At 10,000 feet, the pressure is roughly 300 times what you feel standing on the surface. A human body, unprotected, would be crushed to almost nothing within seconds. It is completely dark, not dim, not shadowy, but absolutely perfectly black. The water temperature hovers just above freezing, always, and it's quiet. In the shallow ocean, life is everywhere: plants, sunlight, movement, oxygen. But at 10,000 feet, almost none of that reaches the bottom. There are no plants down there, no photosynthesis, no daily rhythm. Nothing grows, nothing blooms. The entire seafloor, millions of square miles of it, is essentially a desert, a freezing, pitch-black desert with 300 atmospheres of pressure pushing down on everything in it. The only food that reaches this depth comes from above, drifting down from the surface world in what scientists call marine snow, tiny fragments of dead plankton, feces, and organic particles that have been picked apart by mid-water creatures on the way down. By the time it arrives, there's almost nothing left. Life down here exists in a state of permanent near-starvation. So imagine what happens when a 60,000-pound whale suddenly falls out of the sky, because that's exactly what it feels like to everything living on that seafloor. The whale doesn't float back up. At depth, the pressure crushes the gases produced during decomposition before they can inflate the body. So it sinks, slowly, spinning in the dark for hours. And when it finally lands with a soft, massive thud on the sediment floor, it's like a city appearing overnight in the middle of a desert. What happens in the next 50 years is unlike anything else in biology. What does a whale fall look like from above as it drifts down into the deep? What's the first thing that finds it? Within hours of the whale hitting the floor, something detects it. Not by sight, not by sound, by smell. The carcass starts releasing cadaverine and putrescine, the chemical compounds that all rotting flesh produces. In the open air, these smells are nauseating. At the bottom of the ocean, they're a beacon, a chemical signal that travels for miles through the water, announcing that food, real food, not marine snow, has arrived. The first wave of visitors are the big scavengers. Sleeper sharks, often over 20 feet long, arrive within 24 hours. They don't waste time. They tear into the soft tissue at rates of over 40 kilograms per day. Hagfish follow, burrowing directly into the carcass through its orifices, eating from the inside. Giant isopods, crustaceans the size of footballs, arrive in enormous numbers and strip away what the sharks leave behind. Within the first 2 years, up to 90% of the whale's soft tissue is gone. What's left is the skeleton, And here's where most people assume the story ends. The bones bleach in the deep. Nothing can survive on bones. The food is gone. Except it isn't. Packed inside the whale's skeleton, sealed inside the mineral matrix of the bones themselves, is an enormous reservoir of fat, lipids, oils. Locked in the bone marrow in the cortical structure, invisible to the scavengers above. Nobody can get to it. Nobody except one creature. When the camera footage from that 1998 dive was analyzed, scientists noticed something on the bones that had never been formally described. That red, fuzzy carpet. It wasn't random growth. It had structure. It was organized, dense. It was alive, and it was eating. What they had stumbled onto was a creature so specialized, so biologically extreme, that it forced scientists to rewrite the textbook on how deep-sea ecosystems actually function. How does a creature without a mouth eat? How does it even reach food it can't see or touch? The creatures covering those bones were formally described and named in 2004. Osedax, Latin for bone devourer. They are annelids, worms, technically, but calling them worms is like calling a jumbo jet a metal tube. It's not wrong. It's just not close to capturing what's actually going on. Here's what makes Osedax genuinely, deeply strange. Adult female Osedax have no mouth, no gut, no stomach. Their body plan has been stripped down to 4 parts: feathery gill-like plumes that extend above the bone surface, a muscular trunk, a reproductive organ, and a root system. That root system is the thing. It's not a metaphor. Osedax literally grows roots, branching, spreading, penetrating root structures that push directly into the mineral matrix of vertebrate bone. Those roots don't absorb food passively. They make it. Inside the root cells, Osedax runs a biological process that should not be possible for a worm. It secretes acid, not stomach acid, not incidental acid, a specifically engineered, controlled chemical attack on the calcium phosphate compound that makes up bone, a mineral called hydroxyapatite. The roots pump hydrogen ions directly onto the bone's surface, lowering the pH at the contact point low enough to dissolve solid bone into liquid. Think about that. A worm with no mouth has evolved to produce targeted acid dissolution of solid mineral. It doesn't bite through bone. It doesn't grind through bone. It chemically deactivates the mineral structure, then absorbs the fat and collagen that gets released. And here's the kicker. This mechanism is nearly identical to how your own body breaks down bone tissue. Mammalian osteoclasts, the cells in your skeleton responsible for bone resorption, use the same proton pump system, the same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. A worm at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean independently evolved the same bone-dissolving biochemistry as vertebrate animals. That's convergent evolution so precise it looks almost like plagiarism. But there's a second layer to this, and it's even stranger. If the worm secretes acid to break down bone, what happens to all that acid? How does it not destroy the worm itself? And what's actually living inside those roots? The acid secretion in Osedax is driven by an enzyme called vacuolar H+ at pace, VHA for short. It sits in the outer membrane of the root cells and actively pumps protons directly onto the bone surface. To generate those protons, Osedax uses carbonic anhydrase to catalyze the reaction between CO2 and water, producing bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions go out to attack the bone. The bicarbonate gets absorbed into the bloodstream and eventually vented out through the gill plumes. This is a closed system. Acid out, bicarbonate back. The worm doesn't dissolve itself because the acid is directed outward, at the bone's surface, not inward, at the worm's own tissues. Once the mineral structure of the bone is dissolved, there's still the collagen left, the organic matrix. For that, Osedax uses a second biological weapon, matrix metalloproteinases, MMPs. Transcriptomic studies of Osedax japonicus found at least 24 different MMP genes in its genome, 12 of which are specifically expressed in the root cells. These enzymes liquefy collagen, breaking down the organic scaffold of the bone into amino acids and peptides that the root's surface can absorb directly. Two-stage attack. Acid dismantles the mineral. Enzymes dismantle the organic matrix. What's left, fat and amino acids, gets absorbed through the root's expanded microvillar surface. But the worm isn't running this operation alone. Living inside the root cells of Osedax, packed into specialized cells called bacteriocytes, is a colony of symbiotic bacteria from the order Oceanography. These bacteria don't make their own food from inorganic chemicals the way deep-sea vent bacteria do. They're heterotrophs. They take the complex bone lipids and collagen fragments that Osedax extracts and process them into forms the worm can actually use. The root system is a biological mind. The worm does the extraction, the bacteria do the refining. And here's one of the strangest parts of the symbiosis. These bacteria are not inherited. Osedax doesn't pass its microbial partners to its offspring. Each new worm recruits its own bacterial community from the surrounding sediment, which means every individual Osedax on that whale may be running a slightly different microbial operation, adapted to the specific type of bone, the specific temperature, the specific chemical environment. This was discovered by researchers at MBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, who first identified Osedax in 2002 after dropping a gray whale carcass to the seafloor of the Monterey submarine canyon as an experiment. They weren't looking for a new genus. They found one. 30 species of Osedax have now been identified, at depths ranging from just 10 meters to over 4,000 meters. They've been found in every ocean on the planet. Okay, but if the visible worms are all female, where are the males? And what on earth does reproduction look like for a creature with no gut? Here's where Osedax gets truly, spectacularly strange. In most species, the visible worms on the bone surface are all female. The males exist, but you would need a microscope to see them. In species like Osedax rubiplumis, the males are sometimes 20,000 times smaller than the females by mass. Not 20 times smaller, not 200 times smaller, 20,000 times smaller. And they live inside the female's body, specifically inside the gelatinous tube that encases the trunk of the female worm. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of males, packed into a single tube around a single female. These males are pedomorphic. They never fully develop. They remain in a larval-like state their entire lives, living on yolk reserves, essentially energy stored from birth. They don't eat. They don't process bone. They exist as dedicated, microscopic sperm donors, living their whole lives inside the body of the female they were born near enough to find. This strategy has a name: progenesis. Sexual maturation accelerates while body development stalls. The result is a male that becomes reproductively functional at a tiny fraction of adult size and then essentially freezes there. From an evolutionary logic standpoint, this makes complete sense. On a whale bone in the deep ocean, food is finite. Every calorie spent building male body mass is a calorie not spent on producing eggs. The system strips males down to their minimum viable function and roots everything else into reproduction. But here's the partial reveal, and the detail that researchers are still actively working on. One species, Osedax priapus, breaks the entire model. In Osedax priapus, the males are nearly as large as the females. They're bone-eating, just like the females. They don't live inside a tube, they anchor in the bone themselves, and they extend a long, flexible trunk to reach and inseminate nearby females. This is being classified as an atavism, an evolutionary throwback, a species that somehow reverted to an ancestral body plan where males were full-sized and self-sufficient. The question scientists can't fully answer yet is why. What selection pressure maintains the giant male condition in priapus, while every other known species shrinks their males to near invisibility? That question is still open, but what Osedax priapus suggests is that the dwarf male isn't the original form. It's an adaptation. Something pushed the ancestor of these worms toward miniaturizing males, and in at least one lineage, that pressure lifted and the males grew back. If Osedax evolved these abilities recently, where did it come from? And what was it eating before whales existed? Here's where this stops being a story about a weird worm and starts being a story about the entire planet. Molecular clock data and fossil evidence suggest that Osedax didn't evolve to eat whale bones. Whale bones were just where it ended up. Boreholes that are structurally identical to the borings made by modern Osedax have been found in the fossilized bones of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, Cretaceous marine reptiles that went extinct 66 million years ago, before the first whale ever existed, which means Osedax has been dissolving the bones of large marine vertebrates for at least 100 million years. It outlasted the entire Mesozoic ocean ecosystem. When the mass extinction event that killed the non-avian dinosaurs also wiped out the giant marine reptiles, Osedax simply waited and then colonized the new apex carcasses that evolution eventually provided. It's one of the deepest ecological relationships in the ocean, and most people have never heard of it. Now here's the part that connects directly to you and every other human alive on the surface. Whales are massive carbon sinks. Over a lifetime of roughly 100 years, a single large whale sequesters an average of 33 tons of CO2 in its body. When it dies and sinks, that carbon goes to the deep ocean, where, if things proceed normally, it stays sequestered for centuries or longer. Osedax is part of the system that processes this carbon. By breaking down bone and integrating those nutrients into the deep-sea food web, the worms help ensure the carbon cycles through deep ocean organisms, rather than off-gassing back into the atmosphere. But here's what climate change is doing. As ocean temperatures rise and oxygen levels in midwater zones drop, what scientists call the expansion of oxygen minimum zones, Osedax can't survive. It needs oxygen for its acid secretion system. In low oxygen zones, the worms fail to colonize whale falls at all. Studies in the Northeast Pacific have already documented whale bones sitting uncolonized in expanding hypoxic areas. The bones don't get bored. The succession doesn't happen. The chemosynthetic community that normally develops over 50 years never forms. Each whale fall that fails to develop is a broken link in the deep-sea food chain. And because Osedax larvae depend on a stepping stone network of whale carcasses to spread through the ocean, losing even a few sites doesn't just hurt those sites. It fragments the entire regional population. The Osedax disappears. The ecosystem that depends on it disappears. And the carbon that the whale brought down sits there, in bone, inaccessible, until the structural collapse of the skeleton eventually re-releases it. We are watching one of the most ancient biological systems on the planet start to fail. And most marine biologists will tell you that this isn't a future problem. It's happening now. So let's go back to that footage from 1998. The camera sits on the seafloor, pointing at a whale skeleton covered in that dense red carpet. The biologists are watching in silence, because they're looking at something that, at that point, didn't have a name, didn't have a description, didn't exist in any scientific literature. They named it Osedax, bone devourer, and in doing so, they opened a door into a part of the deep ocean that still, in 2026, has more unknowns than knowns. As of the most recent deep-sea expedition, scientists estimate that less than 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped with any meaningful resolution. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone alone, that 6 million square kilometer stretch of the Central Pacific that governments are now racing to mine for cobalt and copper, has yielded 24 new species in a single recent survey. A new superfamily of life, Murrebstioidea, was described for the first time just weeks ago. We are not at the end of discovering what lives down there. We are at the very beginning. And here is the question nobody's been able to answer yet, that keeps marine biologists awake at night. If Osedax has been operating on whale falls for 100 million years, silently, in the dark, at the bottom of every ocean on Earth, how many other species like it are down there right now? How many organisms with no mouth, no eyes, no gut, running biochemistry we haven't described, are sitting on bones we've never seen? One of the most recent ROV surveys in the Southern Ocean recorded a sound from the seafloor that matched no known volcanic or biological event. Rhythmic, low, coming from a coordinate where the floor is supposedly stable. Nobody knows what made it. We're going to find out. Keep watching. Keep asking the questions they don't want asked.